The contract was worth $4 billion. And nobody in that room could read it. 12 certified interpreters. 12 failed attempts. The table was lined with folders, laptops, earpieces, and silence. The kind of silence that sits heavy on the chest. The kind that makes men in expensive suits start loosening their collars. Darian Volkov didn't loosen his collar. He sat at the head of the table with both hands flat on the surface, watching each interpreter stumble through the multilingual encryption like amateurs handed a surgeon's scalpel. His jaw was tight. His eyes were steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The air in that room already knew who owned it. HI viewers, if you were Selim, sitting in that room, blind, being dismissed, would you have stayed quiet or shown them everything right away? Drop your answer in the comments. Selim Ivers sat at the far end of the table. Plain cardigan, dark glasses, posture calm. Almost too calm for a room burning with tension. He hadn't been formally introduced. Someone near the back had whispered "diversity hire" under their breath when he walked in, and 2 people had laughed. Not loud enough to be rude, just loud enough to be heard. He heard it. He always heard things people assumed he missed. The 12th interpreter pushed back from the table and shook his head. The layering is too complex. The dialects shift mid-clause. It's not standard multilingual contract formatting. Whoever designed this wanted it to fail traditional interpretation. Darian's eyes moved to Selim. Not warm, not curious, just calculating. "You've been quiet," Darian said. "I've been listening," Selim replied. The room shifted slightly. A few heads turned. "The audio feed," Selim continued. "May I review it from the beginning?" One of Darian's men looked at him like he'd asked to borrow a private jet. But Darian gave a single nod. They replayed it. Selim sat still. No notepad. No device. Just his hands resting in his lap and his head angled slightly to the left the way it always did when he was processing layers of sound that most people couldn't separate. Then he started talking. Russian first. Clean, unaccented, precise. Then Italian, shifting the cadence without hesitation. Then Mandarin. Formal register, not conversational. Arabic with a Levantine lean. Serbian. French. Turkish. Cantonese. 8 languages. No breaks. No backtracking. No apologies. The room didn't clap. It went completely, totally still. Selim finished translating the final clause, set both hands back in his lap, and waited. That should have been the moment. The exhale. The relief. 12 interpreters had failed, and one quiet man in a plain cardigan had saved a $4 billion deal inside of 11 minutes. That should have been the moment everything shifted in his favor. It wasn't. Darian's voice came low and controlled across the table. "You translated clauses that were not in the original summary. Not loud. Not aggressive. Surgical." Selim's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker. Quick. Gone. "I translated what was there," Selim said. "What was there?" Darian repeated slowly. "Or what you wanted to be there?" 2 of the interpreters exchanged glances. Someone near the window shifted in their chair. The air changed, and not in the way it had moments ago when the room was stunned by the translation. This time the shift carried something colder, something that pointed directly at Selim. Darian reached forward and slid a single folder across the table. "A confidential report was submitted this morning," he said. "It claims you privately altered a clause in the preliminary brief earlier this week, before today's session." Selim didn't reach for the folder. He didn't need to, because here was the thing nobody in that room understood about Selim Ivers. He had already heard something wrong before Darian finished his sentence. Not in the words, in the timing, in the practiced evenness of the delivery, in the way the folder had been positioned before it was retrieved. It had been waiting, pre-placed. This wasn't a discovery. This was a performance, and someone had rehearsed it. Darian closed the folder and looked at him with the full weight of a man who had ended careers, and other things, with less evidence than what was sitting on that table. "Pending internal review," Darian said. "You are suspended from live negotiations effective immediately." No raised voice, no dramatic exit, just a calm instruction, and a room full of people who had watched Selim prove himself, and said absolutely nothing. He stood, picked up his cane, walked to the door without rushing. He didn't argue. He didn't explain, because the man who filed that report had made one mistake. He thought Selim couldn't see it. The apartment was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. There's a difference. Selim moved through the space with the kind of precision that came from years of memorizing distances, of turning muscle memory into architecture. He set his cane against the wall beside the door. He put the kettle on. He sat down at the table where his audio equipment lived, and he pulled up the negotiation recording from his personal archive, a backup, separate from the one stored on Volkov servers, and he pressed play. He had already heard it once in the room. He needed to hear it again, not for the translation. He remembered every word, for the sounds underneath. He listened through the opening section, the shuffling of folders, the tap of a pen on the table, two people breathing faster than the others. Nerves. One person who barely breathed at all, someone who had rehearsed being calm. He paused the audio. That detail mattered. He filed it away. Then he turned to the timestamp logs. He'd requested access before he left the building, framing it as a standard follow-up, nothing alarming, nothing aggressive. The request had been approved without question because nobody expected a suspended consultant to know what to look for. That was the second mistake. He pulled up the file. The accusation document had been submitted at 7:12 p.m. the previous evening. He cross-referenced it with the security access logs for the conference room cited in the complaint, the room where Selim supposedly altered the clause in the preliminary brief. That room had been empty until 7:19 p.m. 7 minutes. 7 minutes where a document claimed an event happened inside a room that wasn't accessed yet. Selim leaned back. He didn't slam anything, didn't curse. Just sat with that information the way he sat with most things, carefully, turning it over, examining each edge. The report wasn't just false. It was assembled quickly. Someone filed it in a hurry and didn't check the metadata. Or they didn't think anyone would check the metadata. Either way, it was sloppy. And sloppy meant panicked. And panicked meant the original plan hadn't accounted for Selim actually succeeding today. He had been a variable they didn't expect to matter. That changed things. He moved to his financial access screen, a specialized interface built for his use, and started searching names. Not randomly. He'd been listening to that room for weeks. He knew who came intense and left calm. He knew who spoke with more confidence after certain people entered. He knew the rhythms of relationships that others mapped with faces. He mapped them with sound. One name kept returning to the center of the pattern. Victor Hale, third interpreter from the left. The one whose breathing had been off since before the session started. Not nerves about the contract. Something else. Something that was already decided. Selim ran a financial search on Victor Hale. Standard accounts. Standard movement. Then a flag. 48 hours before today's session, 2 days ago. A transfer. Not small. Not explainable as a freelance payment. Routed to an offshore account through a shell company registered in a name Selim didn't recognize. He didn't need to recognize it yet. He just needed the thread. He had it. He saved the file, encrypted it, and sat back. The kettle had gone cold. He didn't care, because the complaint wasn't really about him. He could feel the shape of it now, the outline of something larger that he'd only caught the edge of in that room. This wasn't personal. This was structural. Someone was building something, using him as a piece. He just hadn't figured out who was building it. Or what they were building it toward. Not yet. But Victor Hale had just become the most important person in the room. The inquiry room smelled like recycled air and tension. Selim walked in and took his seat without waiting for direction. 3 council members sat across from him. Victor was positioned 2 seats to his left. Not across, not beside, but angled. Like someone who wanted the option to look away. The session opened formally. Procedural language. Standard framing. Selim paid attention to none of it. He was listening to Victor. Specifically, Victor's breathing. It had a pattern. Slightly elevated. Not panicked, but controlled the way a person controls breathing when they've been told to stay calm. There were micropauses before answers. The kind that happened when a person was retrieving a rehearsed line rather than recalling an actual memory. And once, just once in the first 10 minutes, a vocal tremor on the word summary. Barely detectable. Selim detected it. He sat with his hands folded. He answered the council's questions directly. He didn't over-explain. He didn't defend himself with emotion. He offered facts, the timestamp discrepancy, the metadata issue, and presented them as observations, not accusations. He let the council sit with them. He didn't rush. That was important. Rushing tells people you're afraid. Selim wasn't afraid. He was watching. One of the council members asked Victor to clarify his role in the preliminary brief process. Victor answered smoothly, professional, rehearsed. Then Selim spoke. "One question," he said, calm, almost conversational. The council nodded. He turned toward Victor's general direction and asked, in Serbian, "Kada st poslenji put videli originalni nacrt ugovora? When did you last review the original contract draft?" Victor's answer came back in Serbian without hesitation. And it was wrong. Not wrong like a mistake. Wrong like a man who had been taught the correct phrase but didn't understand it well enough to recognize a slight variation. He answered a question that hadn't quite been asked. A version of the sentence that referenced the signed agreement, not the preliminary draft. It was a 2-word difference. Victor didn't catch it. Selim did. He didn't point it out immediately. He just nodded and said, "Thank you," and turned back to the council. Let it sit there. Let it breathe. 2 of the council members had noticed the pause. The moment of slightly too slow response. They didn't know what they'd noticed, but they'd noticed something. That was enough for now. After the session, as the room was clearing, one of Darian's financial analysts stopped Selim in the hallway. She leaned close. "You should know," she said quietly. "The audit team flagged something this morning." Selim waited. The shell company that received the transfer from Hale's account. She paused. "It traces back to a parent company with a very specific shareholder." She said the name. It landed like cold water. The shareholder wasn't random. Wasn't some distant financial actor. The parent company was tied directly, through 2 layers of holding structures, to a syndicate that had been publicly feuding with Darian Volkov's operation for the last 18 months. A rival. A calculated, patient, well-funded rival. Victor hadn't acted alone. He'd been placed. Put in position. Used. Selim thanked her and continued walking. His expression didn't shift. But the whole picture had just changed shape. This was never about Selim. He understood that now. He sat in his apartment and laid it out the way he laid out everything. Methodically, without flinching from the parts that were uncomfortable. The shell company, the rival syndicate, the outsourcing firm that had sourced Victor and the other interpreters, the coordinated failure in that room. None of it pointed at Selim Ivers. All of it pointed at Darian Volkov. The goal was simple and clean. Remove the one person in that session who could actually secure the contract. Create chaos. Make Darian look incompetent in front of his own counsel. Make it look like he'd brought in a fraudulent consultant. Not just hired poorly, but chosen wrong, trusted the wrong person, made a reckless call. In the world Darian operated in, that wasn't just embarrassing. That was leverage. The kind of leverage that moved power. Power rarely attacks directly. Corrodes trust first. Get the council questioning Darian's judgment. Get the rival syndicate in position. Install proxy leadership. And suddenly a $4 billion deal, plus everything attached to it, belonged to someone else. Selim was never the target. He was the instrument. He pulled up the outsourcing firm file. The company that had supplied the interpreter pool, 12 people, including Victor, had been on board through HR 8 weeks prior. New vendor. Fast approval. Someone had moved that paperwork through without the usual review cycle. He traced the firm's registration. Majority ownership was publicly listed, but there was a secondary shareholder, a silent one, registered through a Delaware holding company with minimal public disclosure. Selim ran the name through a business registry search. He found it on the third pass. The silent shareholder was Darian's cousin, enrolled as a non-voting board member of the parent entity. Not in any meeting minutes, not in any communication trail Selim could access publicly, but there in the registry, quiet and unannounced, like a name written in pencil on the back of a document everyone assumed was clean. Selim leaned forward. This was the part that required care. Because here was the problem, and it was a real one. If this connection surfaced wrong, if it came out without context or landed in front of the wrong people first, it didn't just expose a rival plot. It raised questions about Darian, about how deep the insider access went, about whether the cousin was acting alone or acting with knowledge. And if Darian looked compromised, even for a moment, even unjustly, the council wouldn't wait for clarification. The rival syndicate knew that. They designed it that way. They weren't just trying to embarrass Darian. They were trying to make any defense he offered look like cover. Selim sat with that for a long moment. Then he started building the timeline. Every document, every timestamp, every financial movement, every name, laid out in order with gaps clearly marked and evidence clearly sourced. Not a theory, a structure. The kind of structure that didn't need emotion to be convincing because the facts themselves were loud enough. He didn't send it anywhere yet. Not to Darian. Not to the council. The moment mattered. Rush it now and the cousin connection muddles the story. Present it correctly, in the right room, in front of the right people at the exact right moment, and the narrative doesn't just clear Selim. It dismantles the rival's entire play. One shot. He only needed one shot. He just had to make sure the room was full when he took it. The recording was 4 seconds long. That was all it took. Selim had spent 2 days working through the raw archive audio. Not the cleaned version submitted to the review board, but the uncompressed original that had been logged automatically by the conference room system and stored in a backup server most people didn't know existed. He'd found out about it 3 weeks into his consulting contract when a technician mentioned it offhandedly while setting up his audio interface. The kind of detail that disappears into background noise for most people. Selim had stored it. He went back to it now. He worked through the audio in careful layers. Isolated frequencies, background signal, the ambient noise that gets filtered out in standard review because it doesn't appear relevant. He was looking for something specific, not a mistake, not an oversight. He was looking for a pattern. He found it 17 minutes into the session recording. A whisper, buried under table noise, barely a thread of sound. In Turkish, coming from a direction that didn't match any of the 12 interpreters' seated positions. It was feeding alternate translation prompts. Live, in real time, someone in that room, not seated at the table, had been feeding the interpreters a modified version of the contract language through an earpiece. Not all of them, just 3. Victor and 2 others positioned at key sections of the document. They weren't incompetent. They were coordinated. The 12 interpreters hadn't failed because the contract was too complex. Some of them had been guided to fail, given wrong translations designed to look like honest errors. The confusion in the room had been constructed. Manufactured chaos built to make Selim's absence look justified and Darian's judgment look broken. Selim isolated the Turkish whisper and ran it through an audio enhancement filter. Cleaned it. Amplified it just enough. The phrase that emerged was specific. Deliberate. It referenced a financial clause, the exact clause Selim had caught and translated correctly, and it provided a false rendering designed to skew the value of the agreement by 11%. 11% of $4 billion. That number wasn't accidental. He kept working. The payment trail Victor had used, the offshore transfer 48 hours before the session. He ran it again, this time following the secondary movement. Where did the money go after the shell company received it? He traced it through 3 hops, each one routed through a different jurisdiction. On the 4th hop, the account name surfaced. It was registered to a logistics arm connected directly to the rival Alpha Syndicate. Not ambiguously connected. Directly. Selim sat back. He had the whisper recording. He had the payment trail. He had the timestamp discrepancy from the complaint document. He had Victor's failed Serbian response in the inquiry. He had the outsourcing firm's hidden shareholder connection. Five pieces. Clean. Sourced. Verifiable. But here was the problem he hadn't fully solved yet, and it was the one that kept him still at the table well past midnight. If he presented this at the wrong moment, Darian's credibility didn't survive the cousin detail. The rival syndicate had built the story so that even a perfect defense created collateral damage. The cousin connection, even if Darian knew nothing about it, would get amplified. Questioned. The council would hesitate. That hesitation was the actual weapon. Expose it prematurely. And the rival wins anyway. The council reconvening was scheduled in 4 days. Selim needed the room full. Media observers. Senior members. The full council. All of it public. Because public exposure was the one thing the rival syndicate hadn't been able to account for in their design. They'd built this to operate in private review. In closed-door hearings where the cousin connection could sit in the air without resolution. In front of cameras, in front of observers, in front of people who had no stake in protecting either side, the same evidence played differently. For days, he started preparing. Not loudly, not visibly. He requested a formal council reconvening through proper channels. Standard language, no alarm in the phrasing. Framed as a right to address the inquiry findings before any permanent decisions were made. Approved within the hour. He filed confirmation. Then he closed his equipment down, got up, and went to the window. He stood there for a while. Not because he could see anything, but because standing near open space helped him think. For days, every move they'd made had been designed to silence him before he could reach that room. They hadn't counted on one thing. He had already heard everything he needed. And unlike them, he remembered every word. Victor Hale was sweating before he sat down. The council chamber was full. Not just the regular board, media observers lined the left wall. 3 senior members who rarely attended anything in person were seated at the far end of the table. The room had that particular energy of a space where reputations either survived or didn't. Darian sat at the head. Still, watching. Selim was seated at the lower end of the table. Same position as before, same plain cardigan, same stillness. Like nothing in the room applied to him until he decided it did. The lead council member opened the session formally. Review of the inquiry findings. Standard procedure. He noted that Selim had formally requested time to demonstrate a point of evidence before the board reached any conclusions. Request granted. Selim stood. He didn't use notes. He never used notes. He asked for the original contract audio to be played through the room speakers, the full, unedited version, not the clean file the review board had been using. There was brief hesitation from the tech team. Then Darian gave a single nod. The audio played. Selim let it run for exactly 4 minutes. Then he raised one hand. It stopped. What you just heard in that segment, he said, contains 8 languages and 12 translation attempts. The official report describes the failure as a complexity issue. The dialects were too layered. The formatting too irregular. He paused. That's not what happened. He asked the tech team to isolate a specific frequency band. 17 minutes and 40 seconds into the recording. He gave them the exact number. They ran it. The room heard it. For seconds of whispered Turkish, barely there, almost background, feeding an alternate translation of the clause in question. Nobody moved. Selim spoke again. That whisper was not equipment interference. It was a live prompt, delivered through a directional audio device to 3 interpreters seated at the contract's key financial sections. He let that sit for 2 full seconds. The interpreters were not incompetent. 3 of them were directed to fail. One of the media observers leaned forward. Victor's hands were flat on the table. Both of them pressed down, like he needed to feel something solid. Selim turned, not toward Victor, but toward the council, and said, in Cantonese, the original clause promised full equity transfer upon contract completion. He shifted his weight slightly. The version Victor delivered to this board promised a 60-day review clause instead. He spoke the next sentence with no emotion at all. That 11% value difference on a $4 billion deal was not an accident. Victor's chair scraped back. Not dramatically, just movement. Involuntary. One of the council members looked directly at him. Victor said, I was following instructions. His voice came out thinner than intended. I was told the modified version was the approved draft. I received it through proper channels. From whom? The lead council member asked. Victor's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then quietly he said a name. A senior council member, not junior staff, not an outsider. Someone who had been sitting in this building for 11 years, who had a reserved parking space and a name on a conference room door. The room didn't erupt. It went silent in a way that was worse than erupting. Darian's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved, slow, deliberate, to the council member Victor had just named. That man didn't deny it. He stood up and walked out. By the time the session closed, 3 phones had been confiscated and 2 attorneys had been called. The investigation that followed moved fast. Faster than most people expected because the evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was layered, cross-referenced, and already assembled. Selim had made sure of that. When the financial audit team pulled the records, the structure was already there waiting for them. Shell companies, offshore transfers, the outsourcing firm, the silent shareholder connection. All of it mapped. The picture that emerged wasn't complicated. It was clean. A rival syndicate, one that had been publicly positioned as a financial competitor to Darian's operation, had spent the better part of 4 months constructing a quiet internal collapse. Not a hostile takeover, not a direct challenge, something more measured. Get inside the infrastructure, compromise the interpretation pool, use a trusted council member as the anchor point, then pull the string at exactly the moment a $4 billion deal hung in the balance. Remove Selim early enough and the contract fails. The contract fails and Darian looks reckless. Darian looks reckless and the council fractures. The council fractures and a proxy steps in. For moves. All of them invisible until the last one. That's how you bring down a structure without touching it. The most dangerous betrayal isn't emotional. It's procedural. Darian sat through every briefing without expression. He asked precise questions. He took no notes. He never took notes. But he absorbed everything. When investigators confirmed the council member's involvement, he sat with that information for a full minute before responding. Then he said, "Pull his clearance. All of it." That was all. No speech. No visible anger. Just a clean instruction that ended 11 years of access in 4 words. By evening, the rival syndicate had issued a public statement distancing themselves from rogue actors and calling for industry-wide transparency reviews. Standard language. The kind that gets drafted before the story breaks. The kind that says, "We knew this was coming." Selim read the statement in his apartment that night. He wasn't surprised by it. What he noticed was the final line. A single sentence, almost buried, about ongoing dialogue with key linguistic partners in the region. Carefully worded. Too carefully. This wasn't a full retreat. It was a repositioning. They were recalibrating, not withdrawing. The public statement was a door closing on one play and another one opening quietly somewhere else. He filed that detail. He'd need it later. The next morning, a message came through on his work line. No greeting, no context, just a time, a floor number, and 2 words. Private meeting. It was from Darian. The office on the 43rd floor didn't look like a place where powerful men admitted they were wrong. It was clean lines, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling glass. The city spread out behind Darian like something he owned, which, in several documented ways, he did. He was standing when Selim walked in, not at his desk, at the window. That was unusual. Darian Volkov didn't stand at windows and look out at things. He sat and waited for things to come to him. He turned when he heard the door. "No one else in the building knows you're here," Darian said. "I know," Selim replied. "No cameras in this room. No recording devices." Selim had checked the audio environment the moment he entered. Clean. That was intentional on Darian's part. This conversation was meant to exist only between 2 people. That mattered. Darian crossed the room and sat down, not at the head of the table, but at the side of it. An unusual choice, the kind of positioning that said, "I'm not running this meeting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I trusted documentation over instinct." Selim didn't respond immediately. He let the sentence exist in the air. "The report came through verified channels," Darian continued. "The complaint was formatted correctly. The timestamp issue wasn't visible in the version I reviewed. It was only in the raw log file." He paused. "I made a decision based on what was in front of me." "You made a decision based on what someone wanted you to see," Selim said. That distinction landed visibly. Darian looked at him directly, not through him, at him, with the kind of attention he usually reserved for people he considered a threat. "You trust strength," Selim said, "not warnings. A person could have walked into your office 2 days before that session and told you exactly what was coming, and you would have asked for documentation before you believed them." Darian didn't deny it. That said something. "You're right," he said, and the simplicity of it, no qualifier, no pivot, said more than a longer answer would have. Silence held the room for a moment. Then Darian reached across the table and slid a folder toward Selim's side. "Chief Linguistic Strategist," he said. "Permanent position. Full clearance. Direct reporting line to me." Selim's hand didn't move toward the folder. He sat with it for a beat. Then he said, "I want to talk about the contract structure instead." Darian's expression shifted slightly. Not irritation. Something closer to interest. "Ownership shares," Selim said. "Tied to any contract I personally secure or verify. Not salary. Not title. Equity." The room was very quiet. Darian looked at him for a long moment. "You're negotiating," he said. Not as an accusation. Almost with something that sounded like respect. "I'm always negotiating," Selim replied. The agreement took 6 days to finalize. Not because Darian stalled. Because Selim was precise. He went through every clause with the same attention he gave audio recordings. Layer by layer, looking for the things that seemed fine on the surface but carried weight underneath. He proposed specific language around independent contractual authority, legal protections that couldn't be dissolved by internal board decisions, direct reporting rights that bypassed department chains entirely, veto power over all future interpreter hiring and outsourcing contracts. Darian's legal team pushed back on 2 of those items. Selim didn't move, not aggressively. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply explained, with the kind of clarity that left no room for reinterpretation, why each term was necessary. Not for him personally. for the integrity of the operation. One compromised interpreter had nearly cost $4 billion. One structural gap in oversight had allowed an 11-year council member to be turned. These weren't personal protections. They were systemic corrections. Darian's legal team came back with revised language. Selim accepted. The agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon. No announcement, no press statement, no ceremony. Just a document carefully worded, legally binding, filed through 3 separate jurisdictions, that repositioned Selim Ivers from a suspended consultant to an independent authority operating inside one of the most closely watched organizations in the region. He called no one. He didn't celebrate. He went home and sat with the silence for a while. Not because he was unsatisfied, because the moment deserved to be felt before it was moved past. Then he made tea, and he started working. The board tension that had been exposed during the investigation didn't disappear when the guilty parties were removed. It redistributed. 3 remaining members had known something was off in the weeks before the session and said nothing. Not because they were complicit, but because they'd calculated that silence was safer than raising a flag. That kind of institutional caution was more dangerous long-term than open betrayal. Open betrayal could be removed. Quiet calculation sat inside the structure and waited. Selim kept notes. Not to use against anyone. Not yet. Just to understand the shape of the room he was now permanently inside. And then there was the rival syndicate's final line in that public statement. Ongoing dialogue with key linguistic partners in the region. He'd been sitting on that phrase for 4 days. It meant they hadn't stopped. It meant there was a next move already in motion. It meant that whatever had been disrupted in that council chamber was only one part of a longer game, and whoever was running the other side had been doing this long enough not to leave their whole strategy in one room. He sent a single encrypted message to a contact he trusted. No explanation, just a name. The same name attached to the logistics arm that had received the final payment in the transfer chain. He needed to know if that account was still active. The reply came back in under an hour. Yes. Selim sat with that. The rival syndicate had retreated publicly. They hadn't actually left. The rooftop was cold and open and quiet. Selim came up here sometimes when he needed to think without walls. Not because he could see the city, he couldn't, but because the sound of it from up here was different. Less concentrated. More spread out. It helped him separate things that crowded together when he was inside. He heard footsteps behind him. Measured. Deliberate. The particular weight of someone who had spent years learning to enter spaces without announcing themselves. Darian. He stopped a few feet away and stood beside him without speaking for a moment. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind between 2 people who had stopped needing to fill space with noise. Then Darian said, "I owe you more than an apology." Selim turned slightly toward him. The council session, the suspension, the way it played out publicly. Darian paused, and the pause was real, not constructed. That shouldn't have happened the way it did. No, Selim agreed. It shouldn't. No softening of it. No, but I understand, or it worked out. Just the honest answer. Darian looked out at the city. "You're the most capable person in that building," he said. "Possibly the most capable person I've worked with in 15 years. Another pause. I didn't see it. Not fully. Not until I watched you take apart an entire coordinated operation using nothing but audio files and a timestamp." Selim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't fail to see it because I'm easy to miss." He said it without bitterness. Just fact. "You underestimated me. That was your first mistake." Darian turned toward him. "And the second?" he asked. "Assuming that once I proved myself, I'd want what you were offering." Selim turned his face back toward the open air. The position, the title, the closeness. Darian was still. "I don't need proximity to power," Selim said. "I need authority that isn't borrowed. Independence that doesn't expire when someone changes their mind about me. He let that settle. You gave me that. In the contract. That's enough. There was a long silence. Not rejection. Not coldness. Something more complicated. The recognition that what had just been said was the most honest thing either of them had spoken to each other since the first day Selim walked into a room and was dismissed as a diversity appointment. You're not going to make this easy, Darian said. No, Selim replied. I'm not. And somehow, in the specific way that complicated things land between two specific kinds of people, Darian almost smiled. He didn't push further. He didn't try to negotiate feelings the way he negotiated contracts. He stood there for another minute, and then he walked back to the door. He paused before opening it. The rival syndicate, he said without turning. You already know they're not done. I know, Selim said. Then we have more work. We do. The door opened, closed. Selim stood on the rooftop alone. The city moved below him, full of sound, full of information, full of things most people heard and didn't register. He registered all of it. Every frequency, every pattern, every shift. He hadn't come into that negotiation chamber looking to save anyone. He hadn't stayed in this building out of loyalty or attraction or the need to be seen by the right people. He had stayed because the work was real, because the stakes were real, and because for the first time in a long time the terms were his. Not borrowed. Not conditional. The deal was signed. The plot was exposed. The rival had retreated. Temporarily, but still. And the man who had tried to dismiss him with a folder and a calm voice now stood in his presence like someone who understood, fully, what he had almost lost. That wasn't romance. That wasn't reconciliation. That was something quieter and stronger than either. He didn't silence me, Selim thought. He just taught me never to rely on anyone's certainty but my own. And that was worth more than any title on a door. If the story hit something in you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or placed at the end of a table that didn't think you belonged, drop a comment below. Your story matters. Share it. Someone out there needs to read it. And if you want to follow more stories like this one, stories about strategy, dignity, and people who refuse to stay quiet, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every story we release is built for people who understand that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits, listens, and moves at exactly the right moment. Don't miss what's coming next.